Going to be in Ephesians chapter 6 this evening, Ephesians chapter 6. We are going to be looking at the first 9 verses, and we have here probably a very well-known passage, especially the first few. Parents love to quote these to their kids, but we have here he in chapter 5 he dealt with husbands and wives, and we're talking about the family unit. And then now into chapter 6, the first few verses, we began looking at the rest of the family unit, which is the children. And not only the children, but the parents in response to the children. It focuses on the fathers, but it's applicable to the mothers as well. And then as well, we have this talk about the relationship between servants and masters and how they are to deal with each other and what that dynamic is supposed to be. That just as we talked about last week when we were looking at the husbands and wives, that God has His established order, that He set things in place. He's also set this up in place all the way into the children as well, with masters and servants, and with each of these, with husbands and wives, children, masters, servants, it doesn't exactly go along with what society wants. Because as we talked about with husbands and wives, is that society says, well, the wife needs to be the leader, that the wife needs to make the man subservient to her, and that's the way that society goes with that. And we have the same thing with children, that we have society that thinks that the children need to be running things, the children think that they should be running things, and we see this in TV shows and movies and all of this stuff. And then as well, when it comes to masters and servants, or slaves, is what he's talking about. We're talking about slaves here. And he says, listen to your masters, follow your masters, because they're your master. Just as God is your master, they're your master, and you better follow them. Now, he does as well, and as the rest of Scripture does, it does hold a standard to those that are in the place of leadership, just as the husband is held to what I believe a greater standard than that of the rest of the family. The master is held to the same exact standard as the servant in the way that he treats his servants. That there's no excuse to treat those that you're over like junk. That you're responsible to do things in the right way. It doesn't mean that you get to do whatever you feel like doing. That there's still a standard here, but God has given us the standard for the way we should conduct ourselves and the way that we should work. This morning we talked about God's statutes and judgments, that they are a blessing to us. The way that God has set this up is a blessing unto the family unit. And there's a reason why Satan loves to destroy this and to upend this, because he knows that if he can destroy anything, especially if he can destroy the family unit, that he can hinder the work of the Lord. And the key to a strong family unit, the key to really any area, is to follow the way that God has established it, to set it in that way. And we need to know what those ways are and to follow it biblically if we are to be successful in the Lord, if we are to be wise, we are to be strong. We need these things. There are no if and buts about it. This is the way that it needs to be. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and we'll dive right into this. Lord, I'm so thankful for another opportunity we have to be able to study your word and just to be able to assemble together as your church and to study it, to learn it. There are many things of your word that are contradictory to our society because of the sin nature that is in our society. And I pray that you would help us to not be distracted by those things, but to realize this for the good that it is, for the help that it is in our lives, and to hear it, to accept it and follow it, Lord. And that through it we can be stronger in our relationship with you, and then we could be stronger as a people as well. Ask you would guide and direct me as I share your word. But everything ultimately will be for your honor, your glory, your will. In Jesus' name, amen. We start here continuing with the family unit, and the first thing that it deals with here is children obeying their parents, and Andrew's already in defiance with that tonight, but it is here for him to hear as well, whatever much he may understand. But we start off here at verse 1 of chapter 6. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth." The first thing he tells here is he says that the children are to obey their parents. The word obey, it means to hear under, to listen, to pay attention to. I like to define it as well as what it means is we need to be listening well enough to understand what it is. My mom always told us that whenever an adult told us what to do, it was yes ma'am or no, or yes sir, or it was yes sir, yes ma'am, or I don't understand. There was no ma'am or no sir. It was you had an opportunity to get clarification if you needed it, but it was you needed to be listening to what was being said. Pay attention to it. We have to, children need to be making the effort to listen and to follow. It requires effort. It's not something that's easy. Nobody likes following somebody else. Our sin nature, our flesh tells us, no, I don't want to do that. But we got to put in the effort. Children need to be putting in the effort to be obeying their parents because they are under the leadership of their parents. And this is an important thing that I think is important that the adults need to remember and learn, is that the children are not the ones that are in control. This is a new thing within society to let the kids control everything that's going on in the family. And what the kids want to eat, that's what we eat. What the kids want to do, that's what we do. And what ends up happening is the kids are doing a lot of things that are destructive to their lives because they're ruling the home. They don't know things. They're supposed to be taught by the parents. And in order for them to be taught by the parents, they have to be listening and obeying. And he tells us here that they are to be obeying the parents because and to be obeying them in the Lord. It's not just something that is in relation to the children and the parents, but this is something that's in relation to the children and the Lord as well. That it's about being obedient to the Lord. If we go back to when we were talking about the husbands and wives in chapter 5, that in verse 21 it says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. 22, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. And then we see as well that the husbands are accountable to the Lord as well. That in each and every scenario, no matter what your responsibility within the family unit, your responsibility is to carry that out in obedience to God. That yes, you're obeying this, but you are obeying God ultimately. That are not submitting to the organization or the structure that God has presented. You are in direct opposition to Him. It is following God's will. And we'll see as well that the parents are accountable to teaching the kids in the right direction to go. They're not supposed to be taking them willy-nilly anywhere. And I like this as well, that it just says right then, for this is right. This is the way it's supposed to be. This is the right thing to be done. He continues into verse 2 and says, honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. And so this next part, he goes and takes it a little bit farther and says that the children are to honor their parents. This word honor, it means to prize or hold in high value for. That it's not just about doing the things, but it's about honoring as well, holding them in regards for who they are as the parents, to value them. You know, there are a lot of children that they may get along, they may do what the parents say, but they should still, that is not everything that is required. What's required is to value them as their parents. Proverbs 1, 8 and 9, Solomon says, my son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother, for they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about thy neck. Solomon told them on the Lord's Son, he said, listen to the things that your parents are teaching you, because it's something that can be very good for you. It's something that is very valuable for you. They have the years of wisdom. They are the ones who are teaching, so receive that teaching. And he tells us as well here that he says that this is the first commandment with a promise, that there's a promise that's attached to this as well. That there are blessings for those that honor their parents. In Exodus 20 and 12, Deuteronomy 4:40, and Deuteronomy 5 and 16, each time the topic of honoring father and mother comes up, the promise is given. And that promise is that they may live a long life, and not only would it be a long life, but it would be that their life would be well with them. That the promise that God gives for children that follow their parents, that obey and honor their parents, is that they will have a long life and they will have a good life. Now, he's not referring this in the sense that if the kid is not obeying, then the parent can take their child's life. What he's saying is that God will bless them for doing this. And God takes notice of this. It'll go well with you. A good life is one that everybody should desire, should seek. And for the children, the way if they have that is by having in here in verse 3, even Paul says, this promise, he says, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. It'll be well, and be a long life. As we continue here into verse 4, he talks about the fathers in relation to the children, though. Just as the husband has a responsibility to lead his wife as he should, as the leader, the father also has the responsibility to lead the children as he should. That you should be, well, let's go ahead and read it. At verse 4 it says, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. What he's saying here is, in verse 2, he told us that children are to honor their father and mother, that they're supposed to see them in a high value. Well, now what he's saying is he's saying fathers, and I believe that this is applicable to the wives or to the mothers as well. But first and foremost, it's for the fathers here. What he's saying now is he's saying, so I've told the children that they need to be honoring to you, but you as a father, you need to be doing the things that make you valuable for them. You need to be living your life in a way that is valuable to them, that is helpful to them, that does give them a reason to follow you. Because the first thing he says is, he says, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. What he's saying here is he's saying, don't give your children a reason to be angry at you. You know, they're going to find their reasons, but don't be going around making those reasons. Sadly, something that I think happens all too often is that parents do a very poor job of diffusing situations. What I mean by that is when there's conflict, the parent contributes to the fire. They add fuel to the fire instead of being the one to add water to the fire. They create a problem, or they add to the problem. Sometimes the problem comes up when there's a screaming match between the child and the parent, or a very vicious argument. And as the child increases in their anger, the parent increases just as much, or if not more, and continues to feed the problem. You're not encouraging them to live as they should. You're not encouraging them to follow as they should. You're encouraging them to lash out. You're encouraging them to be angry with you because you're responding in anger. It is the parent's responsibility to make sure they are not the cause of the child acting out. Now, that doesn't give an excuse for the child, but the parent is supposed to make sure they aren't contributing to this problem. There are a lot of times where the parent is contributing to the problem that the child has. In Colossians 3:21, it says, "Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged." You don't want to be the one that's discouraging them. Discouraging them from what? Look at here at the second half of verse 4. It says, "But bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." He says, they need to not be discouraging them from walking in the Lord. They need to be encouraging them, bringing them up. And I want us to notice here that he says the nurture and admonition. We always like to jump to the father that loveth his child doesn't spare the rod. Well, the parent that loves also doesn't spare the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The Lord uses the rod sometimes. But first, the Lord uses nurture and admonition to encourage. When you nurture something, what do? You give it all of the necessary things it needs to grow. With a plant, you give it good soil, you give it fertilizer, food, you give it water, sunlight. You give it exactly what it needs so that it can grow to be the best plant that it can be. As a parent, you're responsible to give the child everything that is needed for them to be nurtured and to grow. And to not only provide them with all the resources that they need, but to encourage it. To encourage the growth in those things. To encourage them to accept those things. To consume those things. With a plant, you don't just take a handful of fertilizer and throw it at the plant. You don't just take the plant and throw it out on the ground in the yard and then throw a water balloon at it and say, "Oh, I gave you your food, I gave you your soil, and I gave you the water, and the sun will show up when it shows up." Yeah, there's a lot of times that that's the way parents apply their building of the child. They're pelting them with things and saying, "Oh, they'll get it when they get it." They're not setting them up for growth. They're not encouraging. A parent's actions and words can easily promote negative attitudes or discouragement in a child's life just as much as it can promote positive things and encouragement. You know, a lot of times we have the saying the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree because the parent didn't do a very good job of carrying them away from the tree. And the parent, especially the father as the leader of the home, is responsible for making sure that they are not the discouragement, but they are the encouragement. Again, I want us to notice something here. With the children and the fathers, is their responsibilities contingent in any way, shape, or form on the other? No. For the fathers to do what they need to be doing, for the parents to do what they need to be doing, it's not contingent upon the child doing what they're supposed to be doing. And the child is not contingent upon what they're responsible to do based on what the parent does. They're still responsible for it regardless. The way that they respond, in both cases, it's contingent on nothing. It's a requirement. All things in response to the Lord. Something else as well. In order to nurture and admonish a child into the Lord, in order to lift them up in the Lord, you yourself need to be lifted up in the Lord. You can't lift somebody up to a place if you're not there yourself. If you're lacking, and I'm going to tell you something, those that are closest to you, they notice your failures, they notice your faults the better than anybody else. Don't think they don't notice. They do. Something I think it's important as well is be honest. One area that I think a lot of times we fail is in the area of humbleness. We present ourselves as being perfect and all that, and they see right through that. They know it's not true. Sometimes what a child needs is a little bit of humbleness from the parent. As well, when we talk about this nurture, really its main purpose here of he's talking about is the education, training, correction, and then the admonition is to warn, urge. And I kind of like this as well because you're not just telling them you're not just giving them what they need, you're also telling them what they should avoid. Sometimes what a child needs is a little bit of wisdom on what to avoid. As we continue here, we get out of the family unit, but not really out of the family unit because servants and masters is part of a family anyways. But he begins and changes his focus to that of servants and masters. And something that I want to notice here is that Paul never says that the servant has a reason to leave the master. You know, slavery is not okay. But at the same time, we actually see when you look at Philemon, in the case of a slave that left, Paul is writing to the master saying, please receive him back because he's going to come back, because that's what he needs to do. Paul actually told a slave to go back home because you're responsible to that master as you are responsible to the Lord. That just because they're a master, or just even because they're a bad one, doesn't mean that you have the responsibility to kind of do whatever you want to with it. Now, one of the things that we see is that the master is held to the standard to treat the person well and treat them right, treat them exactly as the way they expect to be treated. And so the first thing that we see here, verse 5, it says, "Servants, slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of your heart as unto Christ." And in verse 6 it says, "Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart." So the first thing he does here is he talks about it from the position of servants to their physical masters here on earth. And he says that the servants are to be obedient to their masters. And he clarifies this here, the masters according to the flesh. Because this is something for a believer, you are a slave to God as well. So we're talking about, and he's going to talk about that you're to do this as a servant to God. But it's to those that are in the flesh. And when he says here in verse 5 that the servants are to be obedient, this is the same as the obey in verse 1. That this is a listen, be attentive, pay attention. They are to be obedient to them according to the flesh with fear and trembling and in singleness of the heart. That they are to, when he talks here about it in fear and trembling, it means to fully follow them and submit to the reproofs and the corrections, the way that the master is teaching, is wanting them to live, and the things that he's to do. They need to respond to those things. They need to do those things. Now, and really, even though slavery is illegal in America, there are other forms of masters in our lives. Bosses at work. Sometimes they can seem like you're a slave to them. There's still a responsibility to respond in the right way. It says to submit to them, follow them fully. And it says as well that they are to be doing this in singleness of your heart as unto Christ. To be fully committed to it. And the reason that you're fully committed to it is because of one reason, that of Christ. That is your reasoning. Nothing else has any effect on whether or not this is needed for you. The single reason is because you are a follower of Christ. So this is the way that you respond to them. You obey. And he tells them as well, he says in verse 6 that they are not to do it just with eye service as men pleasers. And what he's saying basically is he's saying don't just do it when somebody's watching, when somebody's paying attention, when there are others around. Now, we've all had times at work where when nobody else is around or when the boss is around, we aren't really working as hard as we normally would. And somebody says, "Oh, the boss is coming, look busy." It says work just as hard whether somebody's watching you or whether somebody's not watching you. Because you're not to be doing it to please man. It says the reason you're doing it is because you are a servant of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. And this is something. When does the Lord see you? Always. The ultimate person that you're following, the Lord, He sees you always. He knows exactly what you're doing when you're doing it. He doesn't need anybody else to report to Him and tell Him what's going on. He already knows. He saw it. So he says, do all this with the desire to do the will of God in your heart. You're not just doing this out of to check the box, to be fine. You're doing it because you love the Lord, because you care for Him. Our love for the Lord, our desire to follow the Lord should give us the desire and the love to do what we're supposed to do to others. To respond to our masters, to respond to our parents, to respond to our husbands, to respond to the Lord. And he goes and continues with us, talking about it being the Lord. In verse 7, he says, with goodwill, doing service as to the Lord, not unto men. And he tells them, he says, because you're doing service unto God, not man. Yeah, you're doing these things for man, but ultimately it's for the Lord that you're doing this. And he says in verse 8, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive from the Lord, whether it be bond or free. And, the Lord, and basically Paul tells him, he says, and the Lord notices, the Lord takes place, and the Lord will give what is deserved based on what you do. That He's going to respond based on that. And that the Lord, he says here that, and this is going into the next verse when he talks about the masters, but he says, and the Lord doesn't care who you are. The Lord doesn't care about whether you're a slave or whether you're a free man. He wants you to do things the way you're supposed to be doing it. And He's going to hold you accountable to that. And it can either be Him blessing you for doing it, or Him punishing you for not doing it. A really good example of a slave would have to be Joseph. He was hated by his brothers and sold into slavery, and he gets there. And he could have been a pouty face about it. Could have complained about it. Could have complained to God about it. Well, instead, what does he do? He gets right to work. He does everything the best that he possibly can. He does everything exactly the way God expects him to do it. And as a result, the Lord moves him up very quickly in the ranks of Potiphar's home. So much so that he gets to the point where the only thing Potiphar knows about is what's on his table. That Joseph knew more about the finances and the what Potiphar had than Potiphar himself. And we see that Joseph falls on hard times again because of his desire to follow the Lord and to also do right to his master. And we're talking about him wanting to do right to his Lord and rejecting Potiphar's wife, but he was also wanting to do right to his master. And so he gets thrown in jail. And he could have yet again complained, moaned, and whined, and asked God why. But you know what he does instead? He's the best prisoner that he can possibly be. Now, most, when thrown into prison, would have said, well, I'm giving up now. There's nothing else to do. And Joseph said instead, well, I'm going to just be the best prisoner I can be. And he gets to the point where he's the top prisoner, not as like gangs, but as in doing things for the prison master. And he's trusted again. And he's blessed again in prison, of all places. And as a result, God uses him for God's ultimate plan, which is to save his people. And I'm not saying you're going to be second in favor. You're going to be the vice president of America if you do your job well. But the Lord will bless you in ways that He sees fit. You know, I think the greatest blessing that Joseph had was that he was given the opportunity to do the will of God. That was the whole reason that the Lord put him there, was to save his nation. You'll be given more opportunities to do what God desires for you, to see more of the work of God. And then in verse 9, he talks to the masters and he says, "And ye masters, do the same unto them, forbearing threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there any respect of persons with him." And so he gets to the masters and he says, "And so masters, you're responsible to do exactly the same things. You're responsible to treat them right, to not just do things because people are watching. That ultimately you are in response to the Lord. You are a servant to the Lord, and so you need to be doing these things as well. You need to not be threatening them and beating them and hindering them. You need to be encouraging them and helping them. That you're responsible to be the best master that you can possibly be. And to do the most that you can possibly do to help them. There's no excuse for someone in leadership as a master to be threatening or harsh or hurtful. It says care for them, help them, give them everything they need. Because you have a master too. You have a master in heaven who will take notice and will do the same. And I want you to notice here what he says, and he says, neither is there respect of persons with him. He says, in the Lord, the master of all, doesn't have respect of persons. He's not going to go and say, well, you're high in your power. Most of the time, those that had slaves, they were pretty wealthy, pretty high in the ranks, pretty well off, and they got a lot of special benefits from being that way. They'd likely be thinking that they were exempt from certain things, and Paul says, he says, the Lord doesn't care who you are. He holds you to the same standard, regardless of who you are. Now, another thing that this tells them too is that they aren't supposed to have a double standard either. That just because that person, a lot of times slaves were seen as being lesser people, not being, we have even in our own history of our own country, that slaves were considered to not even be people. They were property. They didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to do anything. They didn't have control over any part of their life because they were seen as not being people. And so as a master, they were to see them as the same person as them. To not have respect of persons, to not rank people here and there. Not think one person's greater than another and to treat them differently because of it, that they're all equal. No respecter of persons. And it's easy to do in a place of leadership, to be a respecter of people. But that's not the way you should be. Because God's not that way. You know, and honestly, thank goodness God isn't a respecter of persons. Because if He was, we'd be in trouble. We'd be in trouble. So we have here, we talked about the parent, the father, or the husband, the wife. Talked about the children, and the parents. Now the servant, now the master. And one thing is constant in each and every single one of them. You, I, we are accountable to the Lord in everything that we do. There's not a single part of your life that God doesn't expect you to do it in the way that He would do it. There's not a single part of your life that God doesn't hold you accountable for what you're doing, whether it's as a husband, a wife, a child, a parent, a master, a servant. Anyway, you are accountable for what you do. And if you do not take that seriously, God will take it seriously. God does take it seriously. And He will respond. This time, we're going to go ahead and enter into our